what we're going to be looking at and what we've been kind of discussing since like the birth of political parties and compromises is that the Civil War is going to be caused by a lot of different factors. One of the long term factors really stems from the Second Great Awakening with our abolitionists that come out. I've already talked about our different abolitionists, but this is going to lead to siege mentality in the South that they feel that everybody's attacking them. We know Harry Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin that influences many Northerners to not to enforce the fugitive slave law. And the many Southerners get upset that the fugitive slave law was one thing that came out of the Compromise of 1850. And they believe her book, again, she only does a small stint in the South, that it really isn't a true reality of slavery. John Brown, I haven't talked about him, but we know John Brown will eventually go into Kansas. And in Kansas, he's trying to vote in popular sovereignty to bring Kansas as in a free state. And he will massacre a couple of people at Potawatomi Creek. Eventually, he has revelations from God that he should have a slave rebellion. And he goes into Harper's Ferry to get weapons, but he forgets to foment a slave rebellion. And he's captured by Lee. And the Northerners look at Brown as this great martyr. And the Southerners feel that he's treasonous and he should be executed. He will be executed, and this will lead to, again, the polarization of the North and the South into two different camps. We already talked about William Lloyd Garrison and being the editor of The Liberator, and we will see that he believed that slavery in causes such as Nat Turner's slave revolt, it wasn't successful. It is going to lead to stronger slave codes, and he really is going to be a key person in the abolitionist movement. We know Wendell Phillips, he's the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He's the biggest spokesperson of the abolitionist movement. We already talked about Frederick Douglass. He will write his own autobiography. He will give speaking engagements, being a former slave, to talk about the atrocities of slavery. Last thing, I already talked about Theodore World and how Theodore World will get his influence from Sarah and Angelina Grimke, write American Slavery as It Is, about their views of slavery since they did come from a southern plantation. And it will influence Harry Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. Right. So we've talked about the cotton gin already, and we're going to see that the cotton gin is going to basically intensify the need for slaves. Slavery was a dying institution. Many people thought by the Three-Fifths Compromise that it would die by the 1800s, and it was just the Three-Fifths Compromise was something momentary to keep our nation together. But with the invention of the cotton gin, is going to revitalize slavery, and it's going to lead to this black belt being created from South Carolina through Georgia, through Alabama, through Mississippi, through Louisiana, and to eastern Texas, where there is a concentration of black slaves working on these farms and plantations, pulling cotton and being put through this gin that will be sent to New England manufacturers to produce textiles. Eventually, many of these farmers will commit soil butchery, and we know that they should rotate their crops and they should rest their land. But the amount of profit that they get from being able to produce cotton leads to them overproducing on that land. And when that minerals have been depleted, they want to move west and they want to keep on the expansion of slavery into those territories, which will lead to feuds on keeping that balance. We know the other argument for states' rights, that the states have the right to nullify a law, which is something that our Democrat Republicans have been championed since Jefferson with the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution in reaction to the Alien Sedition Acts because of the undeclared war with the French, where they were upset about the law that prevented them from speaking out against the government, and also the law that raised the immigration requirements from 5 to 14 years. They come up with this idea that the federal government, that the states have the right to nullify laws that the federal government passes that could hurt a state. The other thing we saw of the idea of states' rights was during the tariff crisis, when the tariff abomination was passed that raised tariffs up to 45%. And John C. Calhoun will write the South Carolina Exposition stating that states did not have to follow federal laws and they could nullify them. We will see that this, again, no one comes to the aid of South Carolina at this time, but this brings up that idea of secession. If the government doesn't fix an idea, the people's right to redress these grievances is through secession. Again, they don't do it at this time, but this sets the foundation for the Civil War. We know the Hartford Convention is another idea after the War of 1812 that the Federalists want to shrink our government size and also make it harder for them to pass laws. The other thing that happens is in the 1850 Compromise that the South gets a fugitive slave law that requires all slaves to be returned to the South that may be escaping in the Underground Railroad or through other means. Many northern states are going to pass fugitive slave laws, these laws, and they're going to pass personal liberty laws that are going to nullify them having to send back slaves. And that's a northern attack on the South, and they're not going to like this, and this is going to lead to an idea of siege mentality, that everybody around them is attacking the South, and there's an extreme group of fire eaters that are going to form of people of the oligarchy that felt that these radicals from the North, these abolitionists from the North, these people who are violating the fugitive slave law are attacking their livelihood. We've already talked about transportation and how transportation, mainly roads, canals, and railroads, are connecting the North and West. A lot of these are funded through tariffs, and we're going to see that the South feels isolated, that they're not getting much of these internal improvements. We also see tariffs as an issue as we move into our economy being self-sufficient to protect the American industry in the North. Many Southern farmers are upset because this causes consumer goods to increase in price, and it protects the New England farmer while the consumers have to pay more. And we are going to see that this leads to that tariff abominations and nullification crisis. And I had just talked about that with John C. Calhoun in the South Carolina Exposition, and that idea that they have the right to nullify if the federal government passes a law that does not inherently advance their ways for their states. Again, this is the precursor to the Civil War. One of the things that we look as we move west is this debate about how do we admit states in, and how do we maintain a balance in the Senate. And Manifest Destiny really proves a point that we're trying to keep this precarious balance, and when it's offset, that it's going to lead to the Civil War. And we see it offsetted when the Mexican Cession comes in. We will see the Whigs will try to pass the Wilmot Proviso that will prevent slavery from coming into this area. It's defeated in Congress, but eventually this leads to the Compromise of 1850, where California is let in as free, and it upsets that balance because we have 16 free states, 16 free states, and 15 slave states. And we're going to see that this is going to lead to siege mentality, and the South will go to places like Nicaragua and Cuba and try to make them slave states to maintain that balance in the Senate. We see the spirit of compromises also prolongs our problems. Missouri Compromise basically set up the president one free state for one slave state. Also established 3630. We see the compromise tariff really doesn't resolve the issue. The Compromise of 1850 also delays the war for 10 years, but it offsets that balance by letting in California as free. We're going to see that's a win for the North, and the South in the Compromise of 1850 gets the fugitive slave law, but then it's overturned by nullification laws of personal liberty in the North. We see the banning of the slave trade in D.C. We see the Texas border fixed, and we see popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession. Again, these compromises are not really dealing directly with slavery, but they're just going around the situation. They're sweeping it under the rug. I've talked about how Clay's American system has led to sectionalism. The North, they are going to be mainly manufacturing and relied on immigrant labor. We're going to see they want higher tariffs, internal improvements, and this is what's going to lead to them being part of the Whig Party. The South is mainly relying on cotton, and they're in the plantation system, and they trade mainly with Great Britain and the New England textile mills, and they rely on the ocean, and they don't benefit from the tariff. They don't benefit from the roads and canals. And our West is mainly food production, the wheat and the corn, and they use the steel plow, and they use the reaper, and these people are creating a new area out West. They're being rugged individualists. So the immediate causes of the Civil War, we could look at the 10 years before, even though we know that all of this stuff has been permeating from the 1830s, 1820s, the War of 1812. But the Compromise of 1850 is really something that will postpone the war for 10 years, but also cause the Civil War. We know this Compromise of 1850 is Clay's last compromise. And we're going to see it really deals with the Mexican Cession and what are we going to do with slavery there. One of the big issues is that gold has been found in California and they want to mint California immediately so that this gold could come into our economy so that it could filter in and lead to paper money being created. And so this compromise will be created and we will see the banning of the slave trade in DC, which is a win for the North. Popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah, which is a win for both sides because it could go either way. California enters as a free state. That's a win for the North. Texas and New Mexico border is settled. Texas gets $10 million for that. That's a win for Texas. The last thing that's a true win for the South is the establishment of the fugitive slave law. Eventually, this will be nullified by many northern states with personal liberty laws. So if we look at the Compromise of 1850, yes, all sides get something, but in the end, the South really loses out on their fugitive slave law. This compromise will void the Missouri Compromise. We're going to see that it's going to lead to senators, the balance being upset, and eventually the South looking to Cuba and Nicaragua to turn to slavery. We're going to see the North will refuse to enforce the fugitive slave law. They will pass personal liberty laws, the expansion of the Underground Railroad, and the creation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. By 1852, our three compromisers, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, are dead. One of the things that will be negotiated after their death by Stephen Douglas is in the Louisiana Purchase that he's going to try to get rid of that whole idea of 3630, and he realizes he wants to build a railroad and is going to go through unorganized territory of Kansas and Nebraska. And if they were to come in, they would be free states, setting it to 17 and then eventually 18. So he comes up with this idea called popular sovereignty. Let the people choose. And it's popular sovereignty, but theoretically how he sells it is that Kansas, which is next to Missouri, should be slave, theoretically. And Nebraska should be free because it's a little bit further north. That's all theoretical, but things will go crazy in Kansas because people are going to go into this area and try to turn it to their own liking. We're going to see many abolitionists many abolitionists are going to go into this area, such as Henry Ward Beecher sending his Beecher Bibles, which we know are guns, so that these abolitionists can turn Kansas into a free state. We're going to see Missouri and many border ruffians come into this area to turn Kansas into a slave state. Many people come in here that are ordinary Western moving people who have experienced soil butchery. We're also seeing John Brown come in here, and he's trying to take up arms to create this area as a slave, as a free area, and he eventually will attack people at Pottawatomie Creek. We will see the Democratic Party split over the Lecompton Constitution because the Lecompton Constitution secretly allows all slave owners to be protected in this area, even if the area votes down slavery. The Whig Party will eventually die, and we'll see the birth of the Republican, which will take on all these little factions. And we're going to see the Republican Party is going to take a strong stance, just like the Free Soil Party, against slavery. The Free Soil Party was the third political party that did not take a stance, a traditional stance, like our Northerns, our Democrats and our Republicans, on avoiding the issue. And they basically take this idea that they don't want the expansion of slavery in the territories, not because they're abolitionists, but because they want opportunities for ordinary whites to be able to get jobs. Eventually, the Republican Party will take on the strong stance of no expansion of slavery in the territories, which will eventually lead to problems in the election. Eventually, violence will break out in the Senate when Brooks from South Carolina beats Charles Sumner with a cane when he speaks out about the atrocities going on in Kansas. So things are getting flamed. But eventually the Supreme Court will come out with a Dred Scott decision saying that slaves are property, and all of these compromises that we have done no longer exist because slaves are property and they cannot be taken away. And this Dred Scott decision will divide our Democratic Party. The Southern Democrats will support the Dred Scott decision. Our Northern Democrats will really support popular sovereignty. We will see the Panic of 1857 hit. The Panic of 1857 really strikes in our wheat fields, our railroads, and our banks. This is mainly northern things, and the West feels that they are safe because cotton is king and cotton is selling for a high price. We will see the Lincoln-Douglas debates going over the Senate seat in Illinois. Lincoln is a Republican and he really believes in the non-extension of slavery into the territories. Douglas will champion popular sovereignty, and his whole stance on popular sovereignty that it is superior to what the people want. And eventually Lincoln will ask him the question in the Freeport debate, what will survive if the people vote down slavery? Will the people prevail or will the Supreme Court prevail? And Douglas says the people. And this eventually divides our Democratic Party into two factions, the Northern Democrats endorsing popular sovereignty and our Southern Democrats endorsing the Dred Scott decision. Eventually, John Brown will go and do his Arsenal raid and try to foment a slave rebellion, and he will not be successful. And now we get into the election of 1860, and we see this election, the Democrats are divided, and eventually they will split up into the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. Northern Democrats believing in popular sovereignty, Southern Democrats believing in Dred Scott. If they just would have stayed together, they would have endorsed Douglas. But Douglas, again, is with popular sovereignty, they would have won. And this splitting of the Democratic Party allows Lincoln to win in the 1860 election. And South Carolina has stated that if Lincoln is elected with his idea of no extension of slavery into the territories, that they will secede. And they're the first to secede, and then 7 states will follow them. We'll get into the Civil War next time.